That's it. It's the final race of the season, and although Max Verstappen has already been crowned a two-time world champion, P2 is still very much up for grabs, and P4 is not yet decided in the Constructors' Championship, although it's absolutely advantage to Alpine going into Yas Marina. Will it be Charles or Sergio, Lewis or Carlos, Esteban or Fernando? There's going to be a lot happening on the track, and we need to work out what that means for our teams. Stay tuned because I'm going to share the latest driver viability matrix and the updated consistency rankings with you to try and help you identify a strategy that gives you the win. Play the intro. What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to the Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insight. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. I am just an Excel nerd with a microphone and I love Formula One, and I'm on a mission to build a community of hardcore fantasy fans here on YouTube. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, stay tuned to the channel, and now we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Right, before we talk about team selection for Abu Dhabi, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the fantasy results from the sprint race. Going into Friday, I was really happy with my lineup. I opted to drop Red Bull in order to get Max into my team, and yes, I was one of 61,000 people who activated their Mega Driver token last weekend, because based on his season-long average, I was pretty confident that I was already sitting on at least 123 points, and we didn't even have the results from Free Practice 1 at that point. I also swapped out Lando for Carlos, because if you cast your mind back to this time last week, Lando was reported to be suffering with a stomach bug, and I didn't want to take a chance on whoever was jumping behind the wheel if Lando wasn't. Charles, Sergio and Kevin rounded out my drivers, and that's a seriously spenny driver lineup, so I had to go with Haas as my constructor. Going into the weekend, I was targeting 271 points, 261 points for my drivers, and then that extra 10 points for my constructor, but by the time Fittipaldi waved the checkered flag, I ended up falling 9% short of my target. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds because 250 points is 250 points, and going into the weekend, I was already sitting in P1 in my league. The guy who's sitting in P2 used his Mega Driver on Sergio in Mexico, so going into this weekend, I have a 112 point lead, which means I can play it safe, and I'm pretty much guaranteed the top spot on a local level. But man, Brazil was not the race I wanted from a fantasy point of view. Okay, jumping into the driver viability matrix and starting with the hard passes, no surprises here, the 5 drivers we're immediately eliminating are Yuki, Zhou, Latifi, Pierre and Daniel. And the one surprise driver that's been temporarily banished to the Shadow Realm is Lando. After his DNF in Mexico, Yuki's consistency rating has now dropped to less than 50%. So considering the aim of the game is to score as many points as possible, anyone who's including a driver who's more likely to bag them a minus score than a positive score might need to rethink their team. Latifi is hit and miss. He's managed to get double-digit points finishes in 30% of the races this year, but then 1 in 4 races he's clocking a negative score, so including him is a big gamble. Zhou is just not really a compelling pick for basically the same reasons. Zhou has scored double digits on 7 occasions this season, but his season-long average is just 7 points. So unless you've only got exactly 4 million left, Zhou is not really going to factor into many lineups. Pierre sadly is just kind of trucking along in the background this year. Based on Esteban and Fernando's results in 2022, I think we can safely assume that Pierre will be a viable pick in 2023, but at this point, he's a hard pass. The last hard pass for this week is Daniel, who clocked his second P20 of the season at Interlagos. It's a real shame because after scoring an impressive P7 in Mexico, it looked like the Honey Badger might end his time at McLaren on a high and contribute some good points towards helping McLaren secure P4, but that hope was short-lived. I'm going to skip over Daniel's teammate for now because I want to talk about Lando in context to something else, but technically Lando is a hard pass for this weekend. In terms of the soft passes for this week, there's not actually any drivers on the line in the lower half of the table, so no soft passes, and that leaves us with quite a few drivers to choose from this week. On the top end, Carlos, Lewis, Sergio, George and Charles are all viable picks this weekend. Just a quick side quest. Going into Interlagos, George was the only driver in the top 6 not to have won at least one race this year. But not only did he get his maiden win, he actually set a new record for the most points scored by a single driver across one weekend. So kudos to anyone who used their Mega Driver on George in Brazil, because that little move was worth 195 points to you. One quick thing I do want to point out is, although he is considered a viable pick, anyone thinking that Carlos would be a good addition to their lineup needs to be aware of the hidden risk with picking him. Yes, Carlos is sitting P6 in the championship, and yes, he is the highest scoring driver who is still eligible to be your turbo, but he is the least consistent driver in the top 12. Going into Abu Dhabi, Carlos's consistency rating is now as low as 71%, And for me, what's really interesting is after his DNF in Brazil, Lando now finds himself flying below the line, but his season-long consistency rating is way higher than Carlos's. Lando's consistency rating is a whopping 90%, and he's 4.6 million cheaper than Carlos. So, you really have to ask yourself, do you want a driver who scores big assuming he finishes the race, or would you rather have some extra cash in your pocket and play it safe with a driver who is more likely to finish but is scoring at least 5 points less on average? One final note on these two, Carlos has beaten Lando in 62% of the races this year, so don't get it twisted, the data is telling us that absolutely Carlos is the pick, providing he finishes the race. Moving down the rankings, both Alpine drivers are strong candidates for Yas Marina. In terms of the teammate point deltas, Esteban is currently on top with a 29-point cushion between himself and the two-time world champion. But on the flip side, Fernando has come down in price in recent weeks. So now he's 10.1 million or 2.3 million less compared to Esteban's 12.4 million. And the data suggests that momentum has swung ever so slightly in Fernando's favour again. So if that's enough to tip the scales in your mind, I think having some Alpine in your team makes a lot of sense this weekend, given how hard they'll be fighting to secure the highly coveted P4 in the actual Constructors' Championship. Both Aston Martin drivers are also looking like really good picks going into Abu Dhabi. I really wanted to add Seb to my lineup this weekend, but I just couldn't make it work without incurring a penalty for making a fourth transfer. Same as Esteban, Seb is now comfortably ahead of Lance in the teammate point deltas, and I can't see Lance making up 33 points to steal this away from Seb, not in the final race of his career. And to be fair to Lance, there's no shame in losing out to a four-time world champion by such a slim margin, which is why both drivers are really good picks. On to Valtteri next, who after a mega start in 2022 has kind of drifted to the point where his recent form has actually resulted in him being banished to the Shadow Realm for quite some time. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, Brazil could have been a fluke, but it's possible that Bahrain to Monza Valtteri is back on the menu. It's a risk because Valtteri has clocked 3 P20s in the last 8 races, and there's nothing to say that won't end up being 4 in the last 9, but he scored 22 points in Brazil, and that was good enough for P3 in the points per pound classification. Last but not least, and we'll cover these 3 as one because honestly there's very little between them, Alex, Kevin and Mick. And if you need a backmarker to complete your lineup, then focus your attention on one of these 3 drivers. Based on the season-long averages, the data suggests that Alex is the best pick. His season-long average is higher than Mick and Kevin's, but his recent form is actually the worst of the 3. Obviously, we can't overlook the fact that Kevin got the first pole of his career last weekend, which is amazing, and his recent form makes him the most viable pick. His season-long average is 7 points, but his recent form is a fraction over 9 points. Mick is objectively the 3rd best pick, but he is the cheapest, and that 0.3 million could be the difference between a team you can afford and a team you can't. And although his 2022 performance wasn't good enough to keep his seat for 2023, it's been more than good enough for a driver that costs less than 6 million in fantasy. Okay, so what is my lineup and what am I targeting in the final race of the season? For this week, I am making 3 changes. Max is coming out, Carlos is coming out, and Haas are coming out. Coming in, we have Alex, Lewis, and Mercedes. The reason why I'm going with Lewis and Mercedes is because all I need to do to win my league is bring it home. I've got a 112-point lead over my nearest rival, so I don't need to be taking any risk this weekend. I just need to score some good, solid points. And Lewis is one of only 2 drivers to still have a consistency rating of 95% going into the final race of the season. So what I'm doing here is essentially double stacking that consistency rating by having Lewis and Mercedes. I tried to get George in there as well, but I can't afford him. And to be fair, if something does go horribly wrong, then my concentration risk with having George, Lewis and Mercedes is through the roof. So I think not being able to afford George was a blessing in disguise. In terms of my points target for this week, I'm aiming for 29 points from Lewis, 30 from Charles, 28 from Sergio, 8 from Alex and 8 from Kevin, with Mercedes adding a massive 51 points to the tally. So that's 101 points from my drivers and 152 from my full lineup. In closing, for anyone who needs to defend their current position in their league, I would urge you to err on the side of caution and pick your team based on the consistency ratings. If you need to take the fight to someone, the pressure is on you to predict the unpredictable. Couple of questions you might want to ask yourself. Will Ferrari do what they do and screw Charles over one last time and gift P2 to Sergio? Or will Max just straight up take Sergio out the race to prove a point? Remember, it's not always about who you include, sometimes it's about who you leave out. Big points have been won and lost on seemingly random races this year. anyone who dropped Leclerc for Spain, or added Carlos for Silverstone, or dropped Max for Singapore, or added Lewis for Kota, these picks work both ways. So if we're in for an unexpected result this weekend and you somehow manage to foresee it, then you might be able to pull off a last lap overtake and gain a place or two in your leagues on the final race of the season. That's it, folks. That's a wrap on team selections for 2022. If you're still watching, thanks for watching to the end. I'm planning to come back next year with more videos, deeper analysis, and I'm even hoping to do a few giveaways throughout the season. So if that sounds like something you want to be a part of, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Good luck to you and your teams this weekend. If you want to post your lineups in the comments down below and start a conversation, that would be awesome. Thank you once again for watching to the end. I'll see you in February for pre-season testing.